Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And I want to say a word about what I mean by make sense of the world. There is one way in which Christians are called to make sense of the world intellectually. As if we are confronted with something puzzling, something that we don't understand, we want to understand the world, intellectually and analytically. And this is why we have my friends come on the podcast who are experts in their fields and help us intellectually make sense. But there's another meaning to that phrase, make sense of the world, that puts an emphasis on the verb, make, to make sense. And by that, I mean, I don't think Christians are only called to stand apart from the world and intellectually analyze and interpret the world. We are called to do that, but we are also called to be engaged with the world. And thus, when we confront something that is nonsensical, that does not make sense given who God is and what his intentions are for the world, then I think some of us are called to make things that make more sense of the world, that make the world point back to God's character and God's intentions for the world. It doesn't mean that we're called to make the world completely perfect. That's not our job. That only happens when Jesus returns to fully remake the heavens and the earth into his true intentions. But in the here and now, in the now and not yet, Christians are called to make what you might call signposts that are pointing to that moment, that final day when all things will truly be made in good sense. And so this is why I've increasingly been on the hunt to have guests on the podcast who are making things, not just analyzing, but making things that are like signposts pointing to God's full and good and final kingdom. And I was especially thinking about the housing crisis, which in many ways is completely nonsensical and in this world. And I was talking to my friend, Ben Teague, who was a regular listener and also a financial supporter of Good Faith Podcast. Shout out to you, Ben. And he said to me, the guys you really should talk to, that you really should have guests on, are the Launch Capital guys, Michael Hall and Jimmy Wright. And so today, I am so pleased to have Jimmy Wright and Michael Hall, the co-founders of Launch Capital Partners, join with us to talk about making sense, in the full sense of that phrase, making sense of the housing crisis in America. Michael and Jimmy, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks, Curtis. Great to be here.
So let's start with why we need to make sense of the housing crisis. Michael, start us off. What is the current state of housing in our country, and why is it sort of nonsensical?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Affordable housing, the housing crisis, it's in everyone's local news. It's in the national news. It is really at a critical juncture. We deal specifically in apartment communities, so not single family houses, but larger scale apartment communities. And the reality is that we're missing about 4 million housing units. And so for each one of those units that's not there, that's a family, that's a household, that's a young adult trying to launch out on their own who can't find good, affordable, stable, and high quality housing options. And so the housing market in multifamily, it's really split into 4 classes. There's A class, which is really luxury. So that's what you think of when you think of like that new build apartment community that has a movie theater and a dog park and a nice pool and all these amenities. That's A class. B class are they're usually a little bit older apartment communities, but they're in really nice neighborhoods. And so they're in a neighborhood where a newer apartment developer couldn't really come in. And then you have C class, which is workforce housing. And then kind of below that you have D class or unclassed or just really substandard housing that a lot of Americans find themselves falling into. So when people think about affordable housing, they oftentimes think of government housing, something that's run by a housing authority. In depends from state to state and city to city how that functions. The reality is that's a very small, very, very small and shrinking percentage of the housing stock that's available in America for people who are on the lower income side of the income scale. And then people also will think about low income housing tax credits, which are these new apartments that are built using federal tax credits to really underwrite the property. But the reality is both of those are a very small slice of what's affordable. The vast majority is what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is really just older apartment communities. And so they were apartments that were built in the late 60s and the 70s, and that they're either because of the footprint of the apartment complex, there might be small 1 bedrooms, they might be really big 3 bedrooms. They just don't have the amenity package. And sometimes they're located in a little bit more kind of working class neighborhoods. And so that's really where we fit into this piece of the housing pie. But Jimmy would probably be better suited to talk a little bit about why some of those dynamics have played out, how they've played out, that we're short 4 million housing units.
Yeah, go for it, Jimmy. Why can't we fill the housing gap here for 4 million American families?
Well, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. So,
yeah.
So it would have, there was a lot of apartments that should be there that are not there, and because rents have been drastically different between workforce housing and like the Class A, so your amenity rich apartments. Developers have built Class A property, so they've overbuilt Class A because there's so few apartments in general that it doesn't cost that much more to add in granite countertops, add in amenities, but you get a lot higher rent for that. So they've been building Class A, and they've been turning Class B into Class A. So they've been turning like workforce housing that property that was typically workforce housing into A property, and so the middle has been sort of gutted out. There's also been a lot of money chasing yield recently in the past years. So there's been a rise in syndicators and people who come in and just add value and flip apartment communities and don't hold them for the long term. So they're just in pushing rents and then flipping out of them. But
so Jimmy, it sounds like what you're saying is, given these tiers of housing, A, B, C, and D, there's economic incentives that are like luring capital to chase after A class funding because that's where the highest returns are. But there's a certain social nonsensicalness because basically it means we're building more and more and better housing for the people that are kind of need it less, that already have more options available to them, that have more resources, more privilege, and precisely the people who most need more housing that would make a big difference in their life. We're not building housing for them. We're actually shifting capital away from where the need is greatest. Is that an accurate summary?
That's a great summary. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So Michael, what is Launch Capital doing about this? What are you making to try to bring some sense into this world?
Yeah. So, what we do is we mobilize capital. We work with investors, raise funds, and we buy existing naturally occurring affordable housing. We buy workforce housing, and we try to stabilize it. So oftentimes these are properties where, as Jimmy said, investors are buying it and trying to flip out. They're trying to make quick, short money, which means they don't invest the capital that's necessary to sustain these properties long term. And so they're going to have plumbing issues. They're going to have heating and air conditioning issues. They're going to have roof issues. And so we come in, mobilize capital, bring the property up to standard, and then we work our specific niches that we work with the refugee resettlement community to provide housing to newly arriving Americans. And so we buy in areas that are predominantly foreign-born. And so we're buying existing apartment communities where newly arriving Americans want to live, work, play. and we're buying those properties, and we're going up against competitors who want to buy this, and they want to try to push rents $400, $500. And instead of trying to do that, we try to drive down the turnover. So we try to make it as hospitable of an apartment community as possible, knowing that if we can drive down that turnover, we can still get the financial return that investors are looking for while preserving some of this affordable housing stock that's out there.
I just want to emphasize just how much of an impact housing has on people living in that sort of that tier that you're talking about, especially refugees. So last year, my wife and I, we have a guest house in our backyard, and we were working with a large resettlement agency in the Afghan refugee crisis to make our house available for Afghan refugees. And we got a family that was a mom, single mom of 7 kids. Her husband used to work as a translator for the American military. He died, not from violence, thank God, but died from a sudden disease, right as they were being evacuated. And so here she is, arriving in the United States with 7 kids and no housing. And so we were temporary housing because as a guest, providing guest for it turned into 3 months. And it turned into 3 months because there was no housing stock available in our region. The resettlement agency took forever because it's the exact dynamics you were talking about. All of the housing stock in the Bay Area is gravitating towards the higher end market, or it's low quality for people turning a quick flip, as you described, Michael. So Jimmy, you guys are deliberately targeting refugee populations to provide housing for them. Say more about the human need and impact for housing, because I got a glimpse of it, of just how big of a difference and how big of an impact housing makes. You guys have seen it over and over again. Give us a story or illustrate why stable housing, stable, high quality housing matters so much for refugees.
Yeah, we so Michael and I, we sponsored a Chinese family who's an asylum seeker, and they fled China in 2017, and then flew over to Ecuador, and from Ecuador they walked to the southern border. So they had this family has actually experienced every kind of housing instability that I can think of. So they walked to the border, and then once they got there, he was the only Chinese speaker. No other Chinese were crossing the border at that time. So they didn't even have translators to help him with this court case or help him navigate that. So he was detained, and then she and their 2 young boys were put into a Catholic homeless shelter. So this homeless shelter put a call out to everyone who they knew that served refugees, and Michael and I heard about this family and then brought them into to my basement at that time, and similar to your story, and then from there they were able to get start to get some services and start to work a little bit. And then they moved into a neighborhood that we moved them in there thinking that they would be safer. And it was an affordable neighborhood for them. Long story short, the husband gets out of detainment miraculously, and only to get shot in this neighborhood. And he's okay, thank God. So then now he can't work. so then we move him. We move him again, and then they're in another neighborhood that's a little bit better, but the public schools are bad. And then so now they have a kid that's getting beat up at school, and then now just walking through this family. And then it's to the point where we have donors that are interested in helping them with private school, but based on where they currently live, they can't even get a bus there. So it's just walking with this family and worrying about housing with them along the way.
Yeah.
Michael and I, we've really come to see the human need to where it's kind of like being hungry. Like when you're hungry, you don't think of anything except for getting something to eat,
That's right. Yeah.
So it's the same in these situations that people can't think of. They can't think about, education or progressing in society or anything because they're thinking about where they're going to sleep in the next, 30 days or day.
Yeah. Well, this is just where I think that narrative, like, hey, why can't, poor people just pull them up by the bootstraps? I mean, you just try to think, if you are starting off from a place of housing insecurity from the get-go, how the heck do you don't have a place to put your boots, much less pull them up, right? It's just this, you can just imagine what as a listener, if like what you're like when you are traveling and you don't know where you're going to be the next day, how that throws you off as for just one day. And imagine if your whole life is characterized by that level of housing instability. So Jimmy, you've described just now sort of efforts by individuals like you and Michael to try to bring some sense into this crazy life that this person is trying to live through. But those are the efforts that we made, the efforts you made, those are needed. Individual efforts are needed, they're good, but the system, as Michael, as you described, is nonsensical because it's not building enough housing for these people. Say more about how the launch capital, how your model is trying to change the sort of almost incentive structures or change the structural dynamics such that we can get more housing for the people that need it the most.
Yeah. So, as we said earlier, one of the biggest issues is we've gotten into this problem over a course of 20 or 30 years, and we're not going to solve the problem overnight. But what we could do is we can plug some of the holes in the boat, and so that's really what we set out to do. Is we're going out and we're buying properties that are off market, we're buying properties that are on market, but we're trying to create a capital structure that views return not just in a monetary sense, right? So that we're not just looking at the dollars out the door to the investors. We do care about that, and we believe we have to make profit to be sustainable, and that's how we're able to scale and try to actually address this problem at the size that it is. We have to prove that you can actually make money by doing the right thing, which is buying these units that are affordable and structuring an investment vehicle so that they can be preserved the way that they are. That all the economic drivers that are present are pushing for jacking these rents up. They're pushing for putting subway tile backsplashes in and trying to move this up market because that's the quickest way to make money. But it's not actually creating long-term value in these properties. And so where we fit into the kind of the landscape around this. There's a lot of people who are trying to build new properties, build new affordable housing. That's good. We also need to build new luxury because eventually those will be old apartments and they'll become affordable too. But that's a 30-year from now solution. But what we think just doesn't make sense is that cities and communities are standing by while their workforce housing is being bought up, oftentimes by people not from that city, and is being the rents are being jacked up, and they're the bulk of their workforce who staffs their warehouses, who works in their grocery stores, who works in their businesses, who does construction, they're just not able to access any form of housing. And the supply and demand curve is so misaligned that if you were in an apartment and you got sick and you missed a rent payment and you skipped out on your rent, you didn't even get evicted, you just skipped out. That'll probably keep you from being able to get an apartment. In America, if you have a negative credit score, that's going to keep you from being able to access an apartment. If your income isn't high enough to afford the rent that they're charging, even if you're willing to pay it, they won't rent you that apartment. Just because there are so many people looking for these apartments that anybody who doesn't fit into a perfect box as a perfect tenant is just not able to access housing. And so, it's easy to kind of think, recently incarcerated people, you could kind of, what people have in their mind of who struggles to access housing, that is true. And it also includes nurses and police officers and people who are just trying to work a good job and provide for their family, are struggling to find any place to live. And then the rising interest rate environment making even home ownership even more unattainable for most people is only going to make this problem worse.
Yes, for listeners, I really strongly recommend a great book on this nature of how unstable housing can be for the working class. It's a book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. It's a well-reported, well-told story that illustrates in a very readable fashion just exactly what Michael was talking about, how just one trauma, one crisis, one medical bill for people living on the margins can actually send them spiraling down a pathway towards eviction, which gets them even in a further spiral of instability and narrowed options. So I love that you guys are trying to flip that and actually build more housing. How have you done, Jimmy? Tell us, like, what's the scale of Launch Capital's work? How many properties have you guys been able to redo in this fashion? How many families have you been serving? Give us a sense of the scale.
Sure. Yeah. So we started out 8 years ago with one house, and now we're at 1,300 units here in Louisville. We have 200 and around 250 under contract in Dallas. So we're stepping into Dallas here in the next coming weeks, months, and so we've been able to serve thousands of people now and in our apartments over the past years, and we resettle the vast majority of refugees and immigrants who come through the pipeline in Louisville, Kentucky, come through our apartments now. So Louisville is the only city in the U.S. that resettles where people go straight into permanent housing, where they don't
That's
make
fantastic.
a pit stop at an extended stay or
like in my backyard. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or your basement.
Or my basement, right? So yeah, Louisville's been the only city.
And that's because you guys have built enough stock that they can do that? Like, that's because Launch Capital's impact?
That's what resettlement agencies have said. So we've been invited to refugee housing solution working group at the national level to expand and bring the model to other cities to open up housing. So we're exploring. Now we have our operations here are geared up and ready to go, and we're set to expand out to several cities in the coming next year or two.
One of the things I so love about your model is the fact that you are actually making something like these new apartments and a new financial model that actually truly makes sense. Like, not just in the ways I was talking about, like pointing towards the kingdom, but in some ways you're actually bringing economic sense to a situation. And because it seems like, if I understand correctly, the capital markets have basically mispriced the value of a refugee family, that they think that is a risky bet to make, is to create and then rent housing to a refugee family. And what, Michael, I remember talking with you, what you guys have discovered through your history of this is actually they're mispricing the value of that family, that actually the refugee family is actually a more stable, more financially favorable investment. So tell us more about how you guys discovered that, Michael.
Yeah. And a lot of this was born, and Jimmy can share his story. He's really the one who founded this. I came in about 3.5 years ago as we scaled up the operations, but we're baked around an investment thesis, like you said, that the market is mispricing the risk associated with newly arriving Americans. And so when we were working with refugee families, when we were we met serving on the board of a nonprofit that provides services to refugees. And we saw that these families that were coming, these households, had a strong desire for stability. they had a remarkable work ethic, and that they were unbelievably resilient. And what we saw is that they were really the bedrock of these apartment communities. We'd go in
Mm.
and try to provide ESL or after school tutoring or whatever it was, and they were really this foundational block. And the rest of the apartment communities just turning over and turning over and turning over, and they stay there. And
Mm.
we saw that, thought, hey, there's arbitrage here between what the property manager thinks and what reality is. And because people are more than their credit score, and people are more than their rental history. And so what we found was a really thin problem, that refugees were seen as unstable because they weren't given the option to be stable. They were thrust into substandard housing that they would leave because things weren't getting fixed, or there was violence in the neighborhood, or their kids were at risk. And so they would move on from those initial places of resettlement. And we kind of, flipping the narrative, said these are not a risk, these are an asset. And so how do we build a real estate company that views refugees and the resettlement agencies as customers, and then through that are able to build a firm whose NOI grows, not because we're pricing families out of their housing, but because we're making the housing so attractive for them to stay in, that our turnover is half the industry standard. And so we don't have vacancy, we don't have the cost of turning those units and making those units available. And so
all things which in the typical model drains your bottom line, you guys have basically are avoiding that because you're serving the poor, you're serving the needy, you're serving the refugee.
Exactly.
Yeah. What else do you guys do differently than the standard housing developer?
Yeah, so we have we call it relationship-centered property management. So we're on site on our properties a lot more. So we have property managers and resident managers in our properties in Louisville who live on site. Oftentimes they speak the language. They're some of them are bilingual. They all have a heart to serve the refugee community. So they come through and do light property management work, but then they also use our community space in our apartments to have ESL programs, work with local churches and nonprofits and resettlement agencies to have activities on site. And we actually just hired an impact, a VP of impact is a brand new role who has a lot of experience in working with public schools and medical clinics and local governments. So all that's kind of in the works, where we're really trying to now that we've kind of Louisville, we look back as, even though we've grown, it's kind of a proof of concept. So we've made a lot of mistakes along the way and learned a lot, but now we're coming through with this and kind of crystallizing this proof of concept that we're looking to take to other cities.
And is all those extra services that most private, practically, no other private housing developer is providing services like tutoring, like social services, like after school programs and so forth. What funds that extra layer of service? Is that actually funded by your business model, or do you have to actually get philanthropic capital to provide those extra services?
So both. We've funded and given from our company's profits to a nonprofit to work with different churches and nonprofits around to facilitate that on site. So and then through that, the nonprofit, which is not directly affiliated with Launch, it has raised money from different churches in the community at large to come in and serve the refugee community. So as they get volunteers and people on our properties, and also getting them engaged to serve this population, they're raising money as well.
Got it.
So
I got it. Yeah. So tell me more, Michael, tell me more about the impact you're seeing both at the individual level, but also at the community level. Like, I'm just so struck by the fact that Louisville as a city now can place refugees straight into permanent housing versus going into people's backyards
Yeah.
or basements. I mean, just think about yourself as a refugee. If you could, unpack once and make plans for your kids and for yourself that we're here versus you're going to have to move 5 other times. That's amazing. What other kinds of impact are you seeing at the individual and at the community level?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of things that are immediate, and we see a lot of things that are kind of long term. And to kind of steal from Andy Crouch's interview with you about influence versus impact, we see that dynamic play out. Of there's the immediate impact of when a refugee arrives into Louisville, as Jimmy said, they have a very high success rate of they're going into a permanent apartment right away. And so they are leaving from the airport and going to their home and knowing that's where they're going to be. And the furniture is already set up. They've already had a home cooked meal cooked for them. That degree of stability, cannot be discounted. But in the long term, I think there's the personal impact stories that we've been able to see and watch as we've had tenants for 4 or 5 years, and they move on to buy their own home. And so oftentimes that's the trajectory. We will see a refugee come into our apartment communities, stay, and then 4 or 5 years down the road, they've been able to put themselves in a financial position because they've not had all the costs of moving, because they've not had to endure all these things. They've been able to focus on their family and been able to focus on, getting good jobs, working multiple jobs, climbing up the job ladder here in the United States. A lot of them are moving on to buying homes. And so that's something we get to celebrate often, and is really exciting to see. I think from a city perspective, Louisville and a lot of Midwestern cities, if it were not for international immigration coming in, their population would be declining. And
That's
so,
right.
this is not because of launch, but the city of Louisville, and if you go to Kansas City or Indianapolis or Columbus, Ohio, or even in Texas and across really the Midwest, and a lot of not top tier cities, not tier 1 cities, they're going to have a huge office of globalization because they know they need to bring people in. They need to find some way to increase their population to be able to staff the jobs that they have. And so we see, that impact piece play out. But where we really see is because we, as the owner, we get to determine what happens on our properties. And by allowing these nonprofits access, by turning unused space into community centers, we see relationship happen. And that doesn't scale well. From a business perspective, it's hard to talk about the relationship, but that's where the real impact and influence happens. Is there are Americans who now have an opportunity. There's a pathway for them to come and meet a refugee, and there's a way for that refugee family to get into an American's home. And so,
because of these nonprofit programs, these volunteers are coming in and
Yes.
engaging in relationship, right?
Yeah, and because we have this long-term relationship. The resettlement agencies, their relationship is really front loaded, but year 1, year 2, issues come up. People need help, and they don't know how to navigate it. I barely know when I get a piece of mail, is this junk mail or not? About half the time I open it, and I'm like, got me. But if you're not from America, you don't know that that's not real. Your car's extended warranty is not really expiring, and though just even things as basic as that, all the way to how do I buy a car, or where's there a reputable auto shop, or how do you do taxes? All these things are really made much easier and through the relationship. And we've been able to see the church and the broader community really mobilize around building relationships with the refugees.
Jimmy, let's shift gears a bit because I want to hear about the faith motivation in all of this. How has your life as a follower of Jesus been part of this whole Launch Capital endeavor?
Yeah, so Launch started out of my wife and I moved into a refugee neighborhood because it was where you could get the most house for the money. We didn't even know it was a refugee neighborhood. And then Um, our church at the time, we had a community group, and we wanted to do outreach to serve the community. So it was through going to meet my neighbors from everywhere around the world, and looking around my immediate neighborhood with the church. That's how we got into this and saw the needs. And for me, for us personally, like the call to care for the sojourner and welcome the stranger is deep, and really just touched my wife and I and in this church community deeply. And when we saw that in our immediate area, and went out to serve.
That's awesome. Michael, what about you? What's your faith story in all of this?
Yeah. My wife and I moved to Louisville from overseas, and my wife was actually running, or was the teacher for the family center at one of the local resettlement agencies. So all the mothers with young kids. So that's kind of how I got exposed to refugees. Here that was really not on my radar. And through that experience, ended up on the board with Jimmy, and really, really passionate that the church should be seen as the kind of the pivot point for social change, like the fulcrum between. There's a lot of people who want to talk. There's a lot of people who will advocate. There's a lot of people who will contend for things and post things on social media, but people who are willing to actually step in and engage and cross that line and say, welcome to America, not out of a bait and switch, not out of some misguided view of evangelism, but through genuine acknowledging people's humanity and coming to embrace them, because we're loved, we are able to love others. And so really just passionate around that, and which is what caused me to leave my commercial brokerage background and step full on into this, because this is something that needs to exist, that should exist, and to your point, seems so obvious once you actually get in it and start understanding it, that it felt like there was no way not to.
Jimmy, that is a beautiful picture. How can people get involved? Well, let's start with how can people get involved in launch capital? Is there a way, or is this sort of reserved for the capital markets, or how does somebody listening to the Good Faith podcast who's attracted to what you're doing, how can they partner with you guys?
Yeah, specifically to launch, like we're looking for we're looking for new cities to go to, kind of prioritizing those cities. So if there's a great opportunity in some churches and just civic organizations that are serving the refugees well, and in a particular city, we'd love to hear about that. And we're also we're getting a lot of opportunities now. We're just really thankful for opportunities to expand, and I think we're really in need of good operators. So like if somebody has an operations background or a real estate background, we're going to be hiring a lot of people. And
is that in Louisville or in potentially new markets that you guys are looking
new
to?
markets? Yeah, new markets.
Okay. Yeah.
And then like we're an investment product, so we are from time to time we take on investment as well.
Michael, say a little bit more about that. If you're a listener and you're like, I love what I'm at least interested in what these guys are doing, and the idea of putting my money to work to actually make better sense of the world, to welcome those who need welcome, to house those who most need housing. Like, I want to put my dollars to work towards that vision. And if that could actually generate some return, that sounds pretty interesting. At least as a Christian, it does. Michael, what can people do?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think that's where a lot of people are at right now, is they want to connect their investment philosophy and what their money's doing with what they feel conviction about. And so, this is not an advertisement, a public advertisement for investment, but
no, I did not bring you guys into that, but I want you guys. I
There'll be a
want it
link
as a
in
service.
the show notes.
That's right, exactly.
A link in the show notes, and people can come to our website and can reach out, and we can start a conversation that way. But yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a good opportunity to plug. There's groups like Faith Driven Investor and Praxis and lots of other communities that are doing really innovative things around connecting people's investment dollars with their faith. So also check out those.
And I know you guys, this is you. I didn't bring you on here, and you didn't come on here, I know, to plug yourselves. But let's plug you for a moment. Like, what would be if a listener, you might be wondering, well, what's the buy-in price? Like, how much capital do I have to potentially be a partner with an initiative like Launch Capital?
Yeah. So just down and dirty is like you have to be an accredited investor. Which you can Google that, and there's a kind of a questionnaire you can fill out. And if you meet those qualifications, like, you can come in. We do have minimums in our funds. We raise funds. That minimum for a fund is usually a little bit higher than it would be for an individual property if we were raising kind of a one-off allocation for that. We are conservative in underwriting and in debt, and we really think a lot of the misalignment in the market is people are valuing. They're looking for IRR, which, if you're in investments or business, you know what it's a time value of money calculation, where if you compress time, you have to make less money and it looks bigger, as opposed to, we're coming in and saying we want to make this a really strong cash flowing asset, and the market and appreciations and what the Fed does with interest rates, that in the long run, in over 5 to 7 years, a lot of that's just going to be background noise. And so we're prioritizing really stable long-term investment vehicles. So we're not a get rich quick scheme, but our returns are at or near the top of the market compared with our competitors, because of some of the reasons that we've talked about, and that investment approach. So looking more in the long term than in the short term. But if there's a family office, some high net worth individual, something like that, who would like to have a further conversation, we'd be willing to have that. But do that offline.
Yeah, we've been looking towards foundations and family offices, and would love to get more connected in that world. We've typically just done it through networking and high net worth individuals.
All right. Well, we'll be sure to put that link in the show notes. I love what you're talking about in terms of getting patient. I guess really one way to call it is you're looking for patient capital that is willing to wait, have a longer time frame for the sake of longer term relationships that can be built when capital is being patient. And that's such a great picture of, you referenced the conversation with Andy Crouch where we talked about how influence requires a longer a longer time versus the short impact. And really, you're talking about, in one sense, the financial model that's based on that, of drawing out the time frame so you can have longer influence rooted in relationships. And we need capital who are willing to actually invest in that kind of patient, long-term relationship building versus a short-term flip of a return.
And it's the beauty and the downside of real estate, right? Real estate's very capital intensive, which is why we're a for-profit. We get asked that question: why are you not a nonprofit? We're a for-profit because we have to mobilize a lot of money in order to do this at scale and come close to addressing the affordable housing crisis, even for refugees. Refugees are put into 150 cities around the United States. So, to Jimmy's point earlier, if you're in a decent sized city in America, odds are they're resettling refugees in your neighborhood, and you might just not be aware of it. And so, but from the investment capital perspective, to your point about patient capital, it's real returns, but it also requires real money in order to do these things and scale these things.
Jimmy, I want to ask you, long term, as you think about, you've been talking about wanting to expand this model to more and more cities, more and more properties. My mind comes to the problem of nimbyism. because these properties are going to have to be situated somewhere in neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And given your model of wanting to kind of connect these communities, these refugees, to the broader community, we don't want to just sequester them off into kind of their own, for lack of a better word, for their own ghetto, right? For their own silos. So doesn't that mean we're going to have to create a culture where communities are going to welcome these kinds of developments into their communities, even if they're not currently, like communities that are frankly more privileged, more resource, have better schools, better parks, that currently don't include refugees? Like, we're gonna have to open up the access. Is that right?
I think in the long term, yeah, that's absolutely right. We right now, there are so many units that are either in these international areas or adjacent to them that have, like, we're buying apartment complexes that have 40% vacancies sometimes. So we're bringing affordable units online in these areas, and that's what we've been prioritizing, just because it's low hanging fruit and you don't have to deal with that exact problem. But yeah, I mean, I think over time, it's gonna have that's gonna be an issue, especially with new building, and depending on the development pattern of a city, that's definitely gonna be an issue.
Yeah, I think you're spot on though, Curtis. That a good deal of the reason we're in this situation with the shortage of housing is we have we have created policies, environmental policies, development policies. We've allowed public feedback cycles that really dictate what happens. And it's really alarming. I mean, when you look at, once again, when we talk about affordable housing, often we're not necessarily talking about the people who are at risk, who can't access affordable housing that people think. A lot of them are probably employees of the people who are showing up complaining that they don't want this apartment built in their neighborhood. And so, a lot of these are working poor. They would have traditionally been middle class, but rising cost of housing and just living costs have really driven them out. And the nimbyism movement over the not in my backyard movement has been far more successful than Jim Crow was at eliminating and racially segregating people. And it's really alarming, and it's a moral and ethical imperative that people get involved. And so one of the ways you can get involved is if there's an affordable housing development in your neighborhood, show up and actually support it. I guarantee you, when you go to that public meeting, there'll be a very short list of people who are there to advocate for it from your neighborhood. And you will hear some alarming things said by your neighbors about these projects.
Such a good point. So important to show up at these meetings, because you can have really people talk about, all these problems, what can we do? Show up at a housing hearing considering a affordable housing development, and you will have disproportionate influence, because very few people show up to those meetings, and the only people who tend to show up are the ones who are most agitated and against those particular housing developments. My wife and I have been thinking more about that. We've been reading another book by Matthew Desmond called Poverty by America, another book I highly recommend, which makes this case, like, show up. We've got to start a YIMBY movement. Yes, in my backyard. And there actually is an organization called YIMBY. We could put that in the show notes. That is a way for us to actually make better sense of this world by making a world that is actually welcoming people into our neighborhoods versus keeping them out. And I think that is so true, that right now we are segregating our world with a socially acceptable form of Jim Crow, and it's just called zoning practices and exclusionary housing practices. So I love that this can be a way for us to get involved. And Michael, it strikes me also that if a YIMBY movement is going to take root in our society, it's not going to be because people like us are hectoring them or morally scolding them. It's probably going to happen because they have met and built a relationship with somebody on the other side of the economic, racial, class divide that they realize the common humanity, that they realize the ways in which we are all made in the image of God. It strikes me that at least the potential for your model, which is building relationships and creating programs that connect, for instance, in your case, refugee families with folks with greater means and resources who are coming to volunteer and serve in these programs, maybe because of their church program, at least has the potential to build these humanizing relationships. Has that happened? Have you guys actually seen that happen in your work?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Brian Finkert, who wrote Helping Without Hurting, I heard him speak once, and he said, it's not that rich people don't care about poor people. They oftentimes just don't know any poor people, is the real issue here, right? And so we have absolutely seen, one of my favorite stories is right at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. A nonprofit was mobilizing church groups, so small groups, community groups, whatever you call it, in your church, was mobilizing to help welcome these people. The resettlement agencies were kind of run over. There wasn't enough social workers. And so these small groups of 4 or 5 families who were already existing within churches were participating in welcome teams. And one of those welcome teams was a housing zoning attorney who was part of it, who was a real estate attorney, and was actually able to help those people. Once he actually drew near to them and saw the problem, they were inviting the refugee family over for their kids' birthdays. They were going over for birthdays and celebrating at their house. It was a relationship of mutuality. It wasn't a one-way, we're helping you. They would actually characterize it as a true, genuine friendship. And what ended up happening was that attorney's like, hey, we should fill out a Habitat for Humanity form and get you a house. And so he helped him, he summoned his legal expertise and helped him navigate all this complex paperwork, and was able to, get them a Habitat for Humanity house. And so, but we've seen that over and over again with, people helping refugees get better jobs as they get closer to them. Like, hey, you have a unbelievable work ethic, and we need somebody at our company. Hey, like, why don't you come work here and double your pay? And so, we have seen as those bridges have been crossed, and I think we also, refugee resettlement used to not be a political issue. It has become a political issue in recent years. And our rebuttal to that is always, whatever you think about whether they should or should not be here, they are here, and they are your neighbor. And so what we're responsible for isn't some national policy. What we're responsible for is how is that neighbor being welcomed and being loved in our local community. And so we have seen the transformative power of those relationships.
Well said. Well, I want to bring us here to start towards a close, and I want to do so by asking you guys 3 questions that I often ask new guests to the Good Faith podcast. And the reason I ask this question is because when we are trying to make sense of the world, sometimes the world can feel so nonsensical and so wrong and so broken that we can feel like we're just delivering bad news. And the title of this podcast is Good Faith. We have something good to bring in the world. And so I always like to end with these 3 questions, not always, but sometimes end with these 3 questions to our guests. So Jimmy, I'm going to start with you. And again, the topics are good news, hope, and joy. And I'm going to start with good news with you, Jimmy. What piece of good news, even in addition to the good news you've already shared with us, what piece of good news do you have to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think as Michael and I have been more involved in kind of the Christian community that is active and trying to do good business and do good in the world, we've seen a lot of we've seen this younger generation really cares a lot about integrating their bringing their whole selves to work. Doing work that matters for the community and the greater good. And even in just interviews recently, I've noticed that we've had a lot of people that want to work for Launch because of the mission. So just, I think one piece of good news is that I'm seeing a lot of younger Christians are coming around that are wanting to do good in the world and are wanting to bring in their case, their faith to their workplace and live it out in a way that's that helps people.
That's
So that's
fantastic.
been exciting. And
Yeah. Okay. So, Michael, I'm giving you hope. I'm not giving you hope. I'm giving you the topic of hope. What personal practice sustains your sense of hope, especially as you do all this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's easy when you're in these. We're not in the helping profession, but when you're doing hard things, it's easy to get burnt out and lose a sense of hope and get desperation. And so, my wife and I, we you try to practice what I was just talking about of drawing near to people who are in need, and that we've been foster parents for 8 years. We live in a very difficult, lower income neighborhood. And we attend a church that's not, solely by ethnic and cultural background. A lot of these practices that get you out of where you come from and your little bubble, and really are able to see how beautiful the church is, the body of Christ is, and how the Spirit moves among people from all walks of life, and all different cultures.
That's great. Thank you. Jimmy, I'm giving you joy. What is one movie, book, or other content that has given you joy recently?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, my wife and I finally got around to watching the movie The Donut King, which is a fascinating movie about the Cambodian refugees that came over and set up this donut empire, for lack of a better word.
Wow, I've never heard of this.
Here in the U.S.
What is it called again? The Donut King?
The Donut King. So it tracks the life of this one man who comes over and figures out how to run a donut shop well. And then all these other Cambodians come over and he teaches them how to run their own donut shops. And it's really happy. It also has sort of a tragic turn for story arc, but they try to bring it back around at the end. But it's really encouraging in one way to, and I've been thinking about recently, like, what are some other opportunities for some of the minority groups, of just the poor, like what can be their thing, like what can be, how can they be the donut king? How can they find a thing to do to get excellent at, and then just build from there. But it's a great movie.
That's great. Donut King, highly recommend that. I'm putting that on my watch list as well. Michael and Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on the Good Faith Podcast and helping us make sense of the housing crisis. Really encourage our listeners to check out their work. If you have capital to deploy, if you are either your own, a family office, or you're part of a foundation, a family foundation, consider checking them out and see if we can put our money to work to truly make more things that make good sense of this world. Michael and Jimmy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis.
All right, listeners, once again, we will be back next week when, as we wander through this world, we will once again gather around the campfire.